Hello, good afternoon, everyone. You should now be able to see my video, and hopefully you see the slide on the screen that says the webinar will begin shortly. Welcome to this webinar. Today we'll be discussing the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship Program. My name is Maria Gann. I'm the Director of Professional Development Programs at the National Academy of Education. And I'm also joined here today by my colleague Angie Harmon, who's Program Officer at NAEd, as well as Dr. Sean Corcoran, who is a recent member of the Dissertation Selection Committee, as well as Associate Professor of Public Policy and Education at Vanderbilt University. So we'll all be speaking today about the Dissertation Fellowship. Hopefully that is the one that you are hoping to learn more about. We also administer the Postdoc Fellowship, and we'll have a webinar about that program later this month on September 30th. If at any point today you have technical issues with the sound or the video, if you just type your issue into the Q&A box, our IT team will assist you. The Q&A box is on the right-hand side of your screen. It's also what you'll be using to ask questions later in the webinar. So as an overview of the webinar, today we will start by talking about what to do if anything goes wrong technically. We'll then go into more information about the fellowship, and then dive into detail about the online application. And then Dr. Corcoran will talk about how to write for your audience and provide general application tips and advice. And then we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end. Please note the webinar is scheduled to end right at 3 p.m. Eastern, and we'll make sure that we do end promptly at that time. So if any questions don't get answered during the Q&A, you can email us at info@naeducation.org and we'll talk with you offline. So just a few technical remarks before we get started. As I mentioned, you'll be using the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. Feel free to type them in as we're talking during the presentation, although you may have some of your questions answered as we're providing more detail. And then we'll try to get to all the questions when we're doing our Q&A. And then, as I mentioned, the Q&A would also be the box to use if you have any tech issues during the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and we'll post it on our website probably sometime next week. And as I mentioned, for tech issues, just go ahead and type the question into the Q&A box. So this webinar is intended to provide information about the NAEd Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. As I mentioned, we do have a postdoctoral fellowship that we administer on behalf of Spencer, and that webinar will be at the end of the month on September 30th. So myself, Maria Gann, and then Angie Harmon, my colleague, work at the National Academy of Education. We are the two people you would be in touch with as you're preparing your application and if you come across any issues. And then we are grateful to have Dr. Corcoran here, who has been on the dissertation committee for several years and can really give you some insight as to how the review process goes, what kinds of things reviewers are hoping to see in applications, and major mistakes to avoid. So the Dissertation Fellowship is funded by the Spencer Foundation, but the National Academy of Education has been administering it for several years. And the fellowship is intended to be the capstone to your dissertation writing experience. So it's meant to be covering the year that you're writing your dissertation, and all pre-dissertation requirements should be done by the time you begin that fellowship. So before we get into more details about the application, I wanted to just briefly touch on COVID because I'm sure it's on everyone's minds. So we're essentially proceeding as normal this year with the application and selection processes. We don't want to disadvantage anyone based on COVID. That being said, if you want to address COVID in your application, if you feel like you have to simply because of the nature of your work, that's perfectly fine. Feel free to do that. We simply don't want to disadvantage someone because of COVID during the review process. So the way we're approaching it is we'll proceed as normal, and then once we have our finalists, we'll work with them to make sure they can carry out their project regardless of COVID. So that means we'll be more flexible with things like timeline. If you need to push back your work a bit, or if you need to adjust your project, we're completely open to that. So I just hope you don't worry too much about it at this point in time, but if you have questions about how your project specifically will be impacted, you can reach out to me or Angie about that. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Angie. She's going to talk more in detail about the online application.
All right, hello. So this is a screenshot of the fellowship application portal. The easiest way to get here is by visiting our website, www.naeducation.org, and following the links from the Dissertation Fellowship page. Depending on what web browser you're using, the portal may appear slightly different, but it should look very similar to this. Next. Please keep in mind our eligibility requirements for this award. Essentially, you should be ABD by the time the fellowship period begins on June 1st, 2021. You do not have to be a US citizen, but you must be enrolled in a doctoral program at a US institution of higher education. We hope that by the time you submit your application, you will have an idea of the timeline for your dissertation writing and revising, and will have completed data collection and conducted an initial analysis by June 1st, 2021, the time the period starts. Note that you may still be eligible to apply if you do not expect to have your data finalized by that time. However, please be prepared to clearly articulate how and when your data will be collected, and how this will not impede finalizing your dissertation by the end of the grant period. And also please note that we do not accept group applications. Next. So if you experience any difficulties with the online application or something doesn't look right with the portal, please contact NAEd staff for assistance. It is very important to make sure that you are applying for the correct program. Once you create a login, you will be directed to a page to choose a fellowship program. Make sure the name of the application you select is the Dissertation Fellowship. If you are a previous applicant, you need to make sure you start a new application and not try and resubmit a previous one, as these will not be assessed. The application due date is October 8th, and the submission, including your references, must be received by 5 p.m. Eastern Time. This is a hard date and time. No submissions will be accepted after the deadline, and no edits or additions to your applications will be made on your behalf by NAEd staff. And let me note that this is a little bit different than some of the other applications that you may have completed during your dissertation, where your reference writers can submit their references after the deadline. That is not the case for this fellowship application. Next. A few more notes on the application portal. Please complete all required fields to submit your application. We also ask that you upload all documents in PDF form and make sure the PDF is not locked. This not only minimizes errors and difficulties for us down the line, but also streamlines your application review. For instance, sometimes transcripts are uploaded that can only be opened by the student or institution, or others will be permanently locked after a specific amount of time. So please do check to make sure none of these securities are in place with the PDF you upload. It is very important, again, and we highly suggest that you talk to your reference writers well in advance of preparing an application. You want to give them plenty of time to write a strong letter of recommendation, as the selection committee reviews these submissions critically. Remember, they have the same deadline you do. The application portal will send an automated email when you input the names of your referees with instructions and a link to upload their letters. Applicants will receive a confirmation email once reference submits their letter. Throughout the selection process, we will provide written updates via email. It is highly important that all email addresses you input are correct. Okay, next. And finally, to close out the overview of the application, 2 pieces of advice. First, all application components, including the letters of recommendation, are due on October 8th, 2020 at 5:00 p.m. Eastern. However, we suggest submitting your application ahead of time. Since we're a small staff, we typically have a difficult time trying to keep up with all the applicants and recommendation writers who try contacting us on the due date. So please plan accordingly and have any questions addressed before the application deadline. With the application overview completed, I will turn over the presentation to Dr. Corcoran, who will talk more about your narrative and your audience. Dr. Corcoran?
Thanks, Angie, and thanks, Maria, for the opportunity to participate on this panel. As you heard, my name is Sean Corcoran. I'm an associate professor of public policy and education at Peabody College at Vanderbilt. I served for 4 years on the selection committee for the Dissertation Fellowship, and so I feel like I understand the process and the dynamics of the review committee very well. And so I have a list of some advice that I like to give applicants every year. The first thing to know is how the Dissertation Fellowship Review Committee is comprised. It includes a wide range of scholars from various disciplines, including economics and sociology, history, anthropology, psychology, public policy, the many fields within education, math education, ESL, et cetera. So you're writing to a very diverse audience. There's also a diverse set of methodologies represented, qualitative, quantitative, historical, ethnographic. And so don't expect that the readers of your proposal will be experts at all in your field or even in your methodology. This becomes more important in the second round. If you're selected as a semifinalist, the proposals go to an even wider set of reviewers. We typically try to assign readers in the first round to have a deeper understanding of your field, but you won't necessarily be given a reader within your own field. So you're writing to a broader audience. In terms of tips on writing the proposal itself, keep in mind that these reviewers they're all busy people. They're reviewing lots of applications. Don't make them work hard to understand what it is that you're doing and why it's important. There are a lot of good applications that come in that the reviewers agree that there's something good there, but they had to work really hard to try to identify what it was. Make the job easy for them. Write in clear language. Avoid using jargon. Avoid just repeating your dissertation proposal. So if you're someone who's at the dissertation proposal stage, you have something sort of ready to go, those proposals are typically written for a narrower audience in your field that may be much more technical than what the review committee would like to see. So don't copy and paste from your proposal. I realize there'll be a lot of overlap, but you are writing to a different audience. It's great advice, I think, to have an outside person read and review your proposal before you submit it, someone perhaps outside of your field. They can provide you feedback on whether they think it's accessible and clear. Not sure if I said this at the outset of this discussion, but I don't want to skip it. So I'll say make sure that your research questions are clear. That's one of the things that's often lost. As you're writing a proposal, you have a really good sense of what those questions are, but sometimes you really have to spell them out for the readers so that they're crystal clear. Work hard on the abstract. Obviously, the whole proposal is being reviewed, but the abstract often gets a lot of attention at every stage of the review process. And so make sure that that abstract is clear and written to a broad audience. Another piece of advice is to highlight what the broad applicability of your work is. Again, these applications are coming from doctoral students in many fields. And I'm a trained economist. And so when I see a proposal in economics, I can immediately see sort of what the contribution and value is of that proposal. But a colleague on the committee who's a historian, who's not engaged in that literature, will not see that right away. And so you want to show how the work that you're doing will have broader applicability in the field of education. So some fields I think will have a harder time than others with this, but it's important that everyone do that. I would say originality is also very important. So there's a lot of very competent, strongly written proposals that are submitted that are just not that exciting or not that interesting. And so there's a real premium to originality and doing something that's maybe a little bit risk-taking or outside the norm. Not everyone is going to be doing a project like that, but I've noticed over the years that those will often spark more discussion and more attention than some proposals that are sort of repetitive of work that's been done in the past. Ensure that you have a strong theoretical framework to what you're doing. That's always really important. And ensure that, I said this before in different terms, but be sure that you're showing how the research will contribute to the field of education. It's very clear if you're in a school of education and you're writing an education dissertation, how you meet the criteria of the Dissertation Fellowship. But for disciplines outside of schools of education, and there's many applicants from outside of schools of education, it's harder work for the committee to identify how that fits in, and as importantly, to assess whether you will, as an applicant, will continue to work within the field of education. That's one of the important criteria of this fellowship. So there's lots of ways that you can do that. I've personally found that the personal statement is very important. It gives you an opportunity to say sort of how you came to the field of education and how it is that you see your work will contribute to the field in the future. Letters of recommendation are very important. That's a good way to get that information in the hands of reviewers. And also demonstrating a record of prior work in education. I can recall a few proposals that seemed like a bit tangential to the world of education, but the more I learned about the applicant, the more I learned that this is someone who had done a lot of work in the past and probably will continue to do so in the future in education. So those are other ways that you can accomplish that goal. One or two more points. So you want to be clear about the work that you've done so far. As Angie mentioned, you're at a particular phase when you're writing this application for dissertation fellowship. So you should be far enough along that it's clear that you will complete your dissertation during the fellowship year or soon thereafter. You should demonstrate a commanding understanding of the literature on your topic and where your work fits in. And to the extent that you have preliminary results, include those results in your application. At the same time, I want to caution you not to appear that you're so far along that reviewers will think that others will benefit more from the fellowship than others. I've seen a lot of proposals like that where it reads as if the work is already done. In some cases, the papers are already printed in journals, in which case, there are a lot of applications we often give preference to those who could really benefit the most from the fellowship. What else? I know I haven't been following the slides very well. Let me take a look at this slide and see if there's anything else I want to make sure. Yes, I should have included this one about multi-paper dissertations. It is true that over the years that the committee has struggled with these. These are very traditional in my field in economics, where you may be writing 3 essays that are very different and in no way connected to one another, and that comprises your dissertation. The majority of fields don't operate that way. And so I'm not discouraging you from submitting such a proposal, but understand that not every field works within that paradigm. And you may want to do a little bit more work pulling those together, or perhaps focus more intently on one of the papers as the main focus of the dissertation proposal. A good piece of advice at the bottom of this slide: ensure that your advisor has a detailed knowledge of your project. You probably won't have the opportunity to read your letter recommendation from your advisor and other letter writers, but I recall some cases in which the letters did not line up very well with the project, and that's a bit of a red flag that the advisor is not fully aware of what it is that you're doing, or there's not a clear understanding of your project. Is there another slide for me? Appendices, good. The committee is not required to read appendices, but you certainly can do so. I will refer to them. I think it's a good place to put preliminary results, especially with quantitative work. If you have some tables you'd like to share that demonstrate the work that you've done to date, I think the appendix is a good place to put them. But just be aware that they may not be read by all of the reviewers. Is this one for me?
I think this is just a summary to make sure we hit home again the 2 key things that we've both been emphasizing, which is start your application early and then know your audience and make sure you're speaking to that audience. So I think that was the last one. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Dr. Corcoran. And Dr. Corcoran is going to, a perspective from a reviewer and a committee member is really a valuable source information. So we are going to move into the Q&A period of the webinar. So if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box. I see that we've gotten several. So we'll just take a few seconds here to review them and kind of organize ourselves here before we start answering your questions. If we don't get to your question, we have the email up on the screen that you can reach out to, info@naeducation.org. And then we encourage you to review very carefully all the information on the Dissertation Fellowship page of our website. So that includes application guidelines, details about each component of the application. It'll link you to the application. It also will link you to the current fellows. If you want to see what kind of work we funded this past year, we always encourage people to look at that because we really do fund a very diverse pool in terms of discipline, methodology, type of home institution, etc. So I'm going to exit out of the PowerPoint so you can see our faces a little better. And then we will start answering your questions. So several people have asked if the webinar will be recorded and shared, and it will. So we'll post it online next week. And we'll also email everyone that registered for the webinar so that you can, you'll be notified when it goes up. So we have a couple questions about the timeline. So whether the data collection and initial analyses needs to be completed before June 1st, 2021, and whether it would be okay for this person to finish data collection around October of 2021. So June 2021 is sort of our typical date. Most of our dissertation fellows will start their fellowship in June and go for about 9 months, and then tend to graduate in May of the next year. That's just a typical timeline. It's not required that you start in June. So if you do need to continue data collection in the fall, the latest you could start would be January of 2022. So that's really the final point at which you could begin. And if you need to begin later than that, we advise you wait to apply till next year, because we do have to make sure you start within the academic year, the same academic year as the other fellows in your cohort.
All right, and we had the questions for the letters of recommendation. Do they have to be tenured faculty? Can a teaching faculty write a letter? And in fact, yes, teaching faculty can write a letter. Your letters should come from anyone who knows your research really well. And if this happens to be a teaching faculty, if this happens to be a member of a lab where you work or someone else, that's perfectly acceptable.
Dr. Corcoran, do you want to speak a little bit about what you look for in the letters of recommendation?
Yeah. So I have two things to say about this. I mean, one, as Angie said, it really should be someone that knows your work. And so it's really obvious when a letter writer is unfamiliar with what it is you're doing. And, you know, obviously no one is going to know your work as well as your primary advisor, but ensure that your writers are fully acquainted with what you're doing. I also like them to have value added beyond the narrative of the application. So a letter that just reiterates the application is not great. I like for a little bit more insight in who you are as a person and sort of the direction of your career and the type of research you're likely to do in the future. And one of the things I wanted to say is that, like, a question that I remember coming up in the past is like, how important is it that you get a sort of a big name person writing your letters of recommendation? And that's something you really want to weigh. There's obviously a benefit to having a well-recognized scholar in your field writing you a letter of recommendation, because the reviewers will know who that person is. But if it's a cursory letter that doesn't really show any familiarity with you or your work, then it in some ways it can kind of backfire. So I do think that there's a little bit of an advantage to getting a well-recognized person in the field as a letter writer, but ensure that that person really is acquainted with you and your work.
Great, thank you. So we have another question similar to the timeline question. Is it okay if My prospectus hasn't been approved yet, but will be in the spring of 2021. Yes, that's fine. So in the application, you'll actually put an estimated date of approval. Doesn't have to be exact. And we recognize you're applying a full year out from when you would start the writing of your dissertation. So there might be some things that haven't been approved yet. You might still have some pre-dissertation requirements you need to go through, and that's expected. Basically what we'll do then is, if you become a semifinalist, you would send us updates on your timeline because things may have changed since you've applied. And then the review committee sees that before they make the final decision. So they can see, oh, okay, the prospectus was approved, or oh, they changed this aspect of the project. So you get a chance to kind of update your application.
Although not revise the narrative. I don't know if
Right.
that's been said, but there's not an opportunity to update or revise the narrative.
Right, thank you.
Well, and on a related note, we had the questions whether applicants are notified of being selected to be semifinalists. So obviously the answer is yes, and you will receive that information typically in early March. But Maria, do you recall the deadline for when they can submit the changes to their application or the update?
So normally, the selection committee will decide on the semifinalists in late February. So you usually hear from us the first week of March or so. And I think we give everyone about 2 or 3 weeks to submit an update. So at that time, you can submit a timeline update. We also then ask for information about your budget, because you don't submit that with your original application. And then I think we ask for like a narrative update if you want to describe anything that's changed since you applied. Okay. So we have a question about the acceptance rate. So we normally receive about 420, 430 applications a year. And then so during the first stage, we have 2 external readers who review the applications. After that review, we move forward. Usually it's about, I want to say 200 to 220 applications. And then the selection committee reviews those and then chooses 60 semifinalists, who are then narrowed down to 35 finalists.
All right, and so somebody had asked about the 3-paper format, which I think Sean covered earlier. So, and the tips that he gave were to either try to tie your 3 papers together thoroughly, or to focus on one specific paper. And Sean, did you have any other things you wanted to say about that?
No, that's about it. I mean, if it is a 3-paper dissertation, you could, one successful model I've seen is one that really focused on the most exciting or most relevant of the 3 papers. And then maybe at the end of the narrative, devote a paragraph or so talking about the balance of your dissertation, what that work will look like.
Sean, I have a question for you. So someone's wondering, to what extent should they talk about their findings? So how much space should we dedicate to preliminary findings in the narrative of the application?
Space. So the narrative is how many pages? 10?
10. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would say 1 or 2 tops. Yeah. Given how important it is to emphasize the sort of research questions, the theoretical framework, the contribution, it doesn't leave you a lot of space to walk through results. But I think a couple of paragraphs with maybe a table in the appendix, if that's relevant, is a great way to signal that you are well on track to getting this work completed. And not everyone is in that same position, but so it's not a requirement, but it's a good sign.
And then another question for you about the 2 100-word essays. So those questions are, let me see if I can remember the exact wording, but essentially, what is the current state of the field on this research topic? And then how will my project, or what do scholars currently think in the field about this research topic, and how will my project impact how they think in the future?
Do I have to answer this one honestly? Okay, so everybody varies in what they pay attention to. And in my experience, I have not spent a lot of time with those particular questions. I do spend a lot of time in the personal statement, a lot of time in the letters, a lot of time in the narrative. And those essays feel a little bit redundant to me. And I don't recall like a lot of discussion around those particular questions, but obviously you don't want to neglect any part of the application.
I think some of our reviewers use those kinds of questions as that's like the first thing they read in the application to introduce themselves to like, how does this person concisely describe the importance of this project? And then they go into the narrative. So in some ways it's a way to introduce your application, but I agree if you are repeating yourself, that's fine, because we are asking you to do that in a lot of ways. So don't feel like you have to rewrite something. If you're taking pieces from your narrative, that's no problem.
Yeah, so don't put your best material in those essay questions exclusively.
The next question we've got was, if, for example, I'm writing my dissertation now, but expect to graduate in May 2021, am I still eligible to apply? And this is somewhat of an unfortunate situation in this case. The next period would begin in June 2021. So in fact, if you're going to have graduated by that time, you would not be eligible for the fellowship this year. And I would encourage you then to consider looking at the postdoctoral fellowship for the time that you become eligible for it.
Sean, do you have any recommendations for how someone organizes their narrative? Are there things about the formatting or organization that appeal to you when you're reading them?
I don't know. It varies so much, and it kind of depends a lot on the disciplinary perspective. But as is with the case with all writing, I like to foreground the research questions, the contribution, in the first few pages. And so if someone were to just read, say, the first 2 or 3 pages of your application, would they really understand what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, and what the contribution will be to the field? And then the remaining pages are your opportunity to flesh out the theoretical framework, the sort of cursory connection to the literature and presentation of any particular preliminary findings. So it's kind of a hard question to ask, but I do like it when I can, in the first few pages, really grasp what the project is all about.
Another question for you, Sean. When it comes to the importance and novelty of the project versus someone's previous work experience and publication history, which aspect would you weigh more in the selection process?
Wow, that's a really good question, because it varies a lot by the background of the reviewers. So there are some fields where publications are very frequent and common among PhD students, and other fields where at this stage you may not have any publications. And I'd have 2 pieces of advice there. Is sort of, one, make sure that your prior experience and your publications to date are in line with what one would expect to see of someone in your field at this stage. But also keep in mind that there are reviewers from other disciplines on the committee who may see it as a red flag that you have not published at this point. And so I do think that having evidence of that is important. If you don't have publications, participation and presentation at conferences is a sort of a next best way to demonstrate your prior work. Work experience outside of academics, I don't recall that ever mattering a whole lot. And I think originality and novelty is really important in a competitive program like this one.
All right, and so the next question is, could you explain what the official approval of dissertation is in the application process? Is that for the proposal? And if yes, can the data I think that means be submitted after after the submission of the application. So yes, that is the approval of your proposal. That is in fact what we mean there. Now for the data, can you have the data collection finish after the submission of your application? Yes. Should you have started it before then? I think that would probably be pretty important. It would probably not be a very wise idea to have submitted your application without having begun your data collection.
So we have a question now about references and how that process works. So when you go into your application, you can, as soon as you start it, put in the names and emails of your 2 reference writers, and they will get the email from our system right then and there. And that's probably a good idea to just go ahead and get them going on their letter, because, oftentimes we get people who are saying, oh gosh, it's going to be late. And as we've mentioned before, we really do ask that the letters come in at the same time as your application by the deadline. So they'll get the email from us as soon as you send it to them. That will provide them some instructions, and it also gives them some information about what the application is for, what the fellowship is about, and then they'll submit via the link to your application, and you'll get a notification when that letter comes in. So you'll be able to see when you get your letters, and you can also go in, even after you submit your application, you can still go in to check the status of the letters and see if they're pending. You can resend a reminder email to the references. So you can submit the application before your references come in. They don't have to be at the same time.
All right, and so the next question was about someone who's finished their coursework in May and they've had their proposal approved. They've received their REB letter and are currently doing field work for the dissertation. Do you qualify to apply? So most likely, yes. It really depends though on the timeline for your field work, because as we said before, although you might not have needed to complete your data collection, you should probably be fairly far along in the process. So please do keep that in mind, and that may determine whether you should apply this year or next year. So just take a careful look at your own timeline.
Sean, we have a question about the second reference writer. Someone's wondering, would it make sense to have this second letter of rec come from someone in their own discipline, or would it be an advantage to have someone in another field write their letter?
Great question. I haven't heard that one before. I could see a slight advantage to having an interdisciplinary set of letter writers. There are some fields, I'll just speak for my own, which is like economics, which is seen as kind of insular. And so if, an economics applicant is just, has sort of just entirely economists who have no familiarity with the world of education as their letter writers, that can rub some folks the wrong way. And so I think there definitely is an advantage to that. I don't see that happen very often, but if there are, if there are folks outside of your field that would be good candidates, then by all means do it.
Great. Someone has asked about a specific fellowship that they have received, and they're wondering if it precludes them from applying. So it's, in this case, the NSF GRFP Fellowship. I think I'll just answer this question broadly, and if you want to speak with us offline about this particular circumstance, that might be useful. But generally, you cannot receive concurrent funding for your dissertation writing phase, because that would duplicate the purpose of our fellowship. This doesn't apply to certain university funding. So for example, if you are going to be a TA during the fellowship period and working less than 15 hours a week, that's completely fine. And we cut it off at 15 hours because we want you to really have the time to focus on your dissertation. There are also instances where you might be getting a departmental funding, and like for maybe $5,000 or something like that, a lower amount of funding, and that usually is fine. It's the other big fellowships that are coming outside from other grant serving institutions or agencies that we don't allow you to accept. So it can be kind of a case-by-case basis, but when you apply, You'll let us know about what fellowships that you've applied to that are pending, and others that you've received. And then when you're a finalist, when you're selected for the fellowship, we ask you, have you received any other funding? And then that's when we kind of negotiate with you to figure out what can you have during the fellowship and what do you need to decline to accept ours. And so in some cases, people do decline ours because they want to accept another. So it's at that point, it's kind of your decision what funding and what fellowship benefits you the most.
And I think we have another question for Sean. And what are the mandatory parts of the dissertation proposal? In other words, is there an outline you suggest to follow? Oh, Sean, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry about that. This question might be referring to the narrative part of the proposal. Before I answer, does the program website give guidelines on how to structure the narrative in terms of sections?
No, we don't really.
Okay.
We don't get specific. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a formula, but a typical structure will be sort of a motivating introduction, a theoretical framework / lit review, preliminary results, and sort of next steps contribution to the field. It depends a lot on the disciplinary background.
Another question.
Sorry, I guess maybe activities involved too. So, methodology, sorry, I said that's a pretty important section that I left out. So methodology. So yeah, basically how you're doing the work that you're doing and an analysis, a brief analysis plan.
This is actually a good segue into the next question for you, Sean. Someone's wondering how to approach the rationale for data analysis piece if they haven't started the fieldwork yet. So specifically, this person will be using qualitative methodology and is wondering, could you elaborate on what we're looking for there?
Sorry, did you say the methodology part or like the
rationale for data analysis?
That sounds kind of like a methodology section. I'm not sure. I mean, there should be a plan in place about how the data will be analyzed systematically once completed. So I think that's what you want to do in that section.
All right. And the next question was, is the application review a blind review? Just wondering if reviewers who know applicants may be disadvantaged. So we actually work very hard to ensure that to reduce bias in our application process. So in fact, your application will not be reviewed by somebody who could conceivably have a conflict of interest with your work. And even in further later application processes, like should you be selected as a semi-finalist, even then, like committee members who may have any connection to the applicant will make sure that we make sure that they have no input on the review process. So it's really important to us to make sure that everyone is evaluated on a level playing field and that nobody receives an unfair advantage.
Sean, a question for you. How much detail do you advise people include in the project work plan where they, put here's this particular step of my project will take place between this date and this date?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And it's also one that I think some reviewers pay a lot more attention to than others. I will say personally that I don't get too in the weeds on work plans because I know that work plans don't often go according to plan. And so what I'm looking for is typically that there's a realistic timeline involved and that sort of if you're still collecting data, that the data will be completed and analyzed in time for you to finish writing the dissertation by your expected graduation. So I think, I guess I've seen a lot of really detailed timelines that when I see that, I don't spend a lot of time myself, like parsing out the details. As long as I think you're providing evidence that you've thought this through and that you have a realistic time plan, that's what matters most.
John, I think we have another interesting question for you, and is, what are some of the indicators that I'm too far along in my project?
Yeah, good one. Some indicators are things that are already in print or accepted for publication. So if a big part of your dissertation is looking at the relationship between X and Y, and you've already got a paper under review that's doing that, or is using the data that you're proposing to use in your dissertation, it needs to be clear that you're going to go well beyond that for purposes of your dissertation. That's one indicator. I mentioned the importance of presenting some preliminary results. I think that's a really good sign that you're making progress. But then again, don't overdo it. And so like if your results section basically answer all the questions that you pose in the beginning of your narrative, it's going to look to the reviewer like you're already done with this work, and that all you have to do is kind of polish it up and send it out. So it's a balancing act. I think you want to provide some evidence of progress without showing that you've already answered all the questions in your dissertation.
So we have a question about the timeline of the fellowship itself. So someone's wondering if you choose to take some time off during the fellowship period, so a quarter or semester, due to family concerns, is that okay? So we can be flexible with you in that situation, because though the fellowship normally is taken over one academic year, you can spread it out over two. So you could take it as long as 24 months. But essentially what will happen then is you will receive your stipend payments, one at the beginning of the first year and one at the beginning of the second. So it just depends on, for the funding, if you want to receive your funding in one academic year, then you would do a 9-month fellowship. If you need to take off time during that 9 months, then I would suggest you extend by 6 months or a year beyond the 9 months. All that to say, we're flexible as long as you start by January of 2021, and that you're able to attend the 2 retreats that are for your cohort, which will be in the fall of 2021. I'm sorry, I think I said January 21. You have to start by January 22, and you need to attend the fall 21 and spring 22 retreats. But as long as it's a 9-month grant at least, and not longer than 24 months, we can work with you.
All right, so we have another question, was whether the fellowship's available to working professionals who are enrolled in doctoral programs. And so this is a tough one. So we, as we said before, don't allow our fellows to have significant sources of outside funding. And you are allowed to work up to 15 hours a week. So the problem is that if you are currently working like a full-time job outside of your graduate studies, that does present a problem for our fellowships. You might want to see about reducing, if you receive this fellowship, reducing the time that you're in your current position and using the funding to try to cover some of that gap.
We received several questions from people who are planning to graduate in the spring of 2021. Unfortunately, you wouldn't be eligible because the earliest you could start the fellowship would be June of 21. But I think Angie had mentioned before, definitely look at the postdoc fellowship. So you're eligible to apply for the postdoc a year after you graduate. So if you receive your PhD in 21, you'd be eligible to apply in 22 to the postdoc. And you're applying a year out like you do with the dissertation, so your funding wouldn't start until the next year.
So we had another question, was whether applicants who are applying for funding for their 6th year in a 5-year PhD program, is this okay or is this discouraged? And this is fine with us. There are some fields where you may be in a PhD program much longer than 5 or 6 years. I would say it's not typical, but as long as you're within our timeline where you are within your writing phase and you expect to finish your PhD by the conclusion of your time with us, you should still be eligible to apply.
Someone has asked, what does the start date of the fellowship mean? It's a good question. So you do need to have all data collected before the fellowship begins, but you can include data analysis as part of your fellowship period. So that's perfectly fine, but really the fellowship should be dedicated to the analysis and writing of your dissertation. That's what you need to be spending that time period doing. And when you begin the fellowship, will also impact your payment schedule when you receive your first and second stipend payments as well.
All right, and the next question is one that I'm really happy to have the chance to talk about, and that was, you mentioned cohort, and can you talk a bit about the cohort experience of this fellowship? And at some point, I think it would be good for Maria and Sean to also give their views on this. So the cohort experience is important to us, and your cohort will be not only, should be selected not only your other dissertation fellows, but the research development awardees and the postdoctoral fellows who all begin the same year as you. And so you will, COVID notwithstanding, have the chance to attend to in-person retreats. And right now we're having those retreats virtually, but an important part of these retreats is networking not only with the mentors and senior scholars in your field, but one of the most valuable parts of this is the opportunity to network with each other and make connections with people who are in your field, but also across fields. It's a regular occurrence that we have fellows who meet through the fellowship and then begin to work together at a later date or start to share information and data with each other. It's, I think, one of the most important parts of our fellowship experience. And Maria and Sean, if you have anything to add to that.
Sorry, I was reading questions. Did you mention the mentoring piece?
So I was talking about really more intra
Gotcha.
fellow networking.
Yeah, I think what you said is exactly right, that meeting with your peers across discipline and making connections also, I think, across career level, because the dissertation and postdoc fellows will mingle a lot as well. Provides a lot of opportunity for collaboration on research projects in the future. And then also just, I think, especially for the dissertation people, having connections while they're looking for jobs is really important and can be super helpful for them.
I agree. It's a wonderful program, and I've seen a lot of evidence of how these cohorts just maintain that connection over many years well after the program's complete.
So Sean, I have a question for you. Can you talk a bit more about what you mean by feasibility and what would a feasible project look like to you? I'm just wondering, as I imagine that different disciplines would have different understandings of this.
Yeah, that's definitely true. What do I mean about feasibility? So I guess it depends on whether the question is about feasibility of timeline or feasibility of the project itself. I know in quantitative research, we have lots of ideas that sound really great on paper. And then when you actually go out and collect the data or do some preliminary analysis of that data, you realize that idea is really not going to pan out because either the specific data you want is not available to you, or it's not measured in a way that will facilitate the type of analysis you want to do, et cetera. With a qualitative project, it might involve like gaining access to a population that you're interested in studying, so having IRB approval and a letter of support from, a school or school district, for example, saying that this is a project that they support is another way of demonstrating feasibility. And so it's, in a nutshell, it's basically showing that you've done the upfront legwork to show that that what you say you're going to do is something that you actually can do.
Thank you, that's helpful. Someone actually has asked about the mentoring aspect of the fellowship. So I might let Angie answer that one because Angie is our mentor expert.
We read that one to me. I was looking through.
Oh, sure. It's just, can you talk a little bit more about the mentoring part of the fellowship?
Okay, great. So I am working on that right now for our upcoming annual meeting. So what currently happens is that you are matched up with a mentor, you're given an opportunity to look through our members and our former fellows to see if there's anyone who you would really like to talk with, and we do our best to match you up with that person. However, I'm excited to say that for upcoming cohorts, this is going to look a little different. So you're going to receive more than one mentor, and we're hoping to connect each mentee with somebody who will be able to help guide them like throughout the process. You will receive new mentors at each retreat that you attend, which will be 2. And what happens is that you submit your materials, generally your application materials and some of your updates ahead of time. And then somebody, a senior scholar in your field, is going to read them. You'll know who they are in advance. And during the annual meeting or the spring retreat, whichever one it is, they're going to meet with you individually, and you're going to have the opportunity to talk about your research, your career goals, really anything that you think is really important to discuss. And then after that, you'll have the opportunity to have group mentoring, because each mentor typically has 2 to 3 people that they're mentoring. So then you'll have the opportunity to speak with your mentor and the 1 or 2 other people who your mentor also spoke with. And it becomes really useful also for networking, because all of you are going to have something in common, and there's a reason that you are all paired with that mentor. So that also ends up being a really valuable experience.
Great, thank you. Someone's asking, what kind of expenses do you expect to see on the budget? We're quite flexible. I would say most fellows approach this as a living expense stipend. So they're using it so that they don't have to work during this year, or at least don't have to work full time, so up to 15 hours a week. And so you can use your stipend to cover your rent, childcare expenses, anything really that you categorize as living expenses. But we're flexible in how you use it. So if you have any questions about that, if you have specific things you're thinking about including, just let us know.
Another funding related question is whether the funding is funneled through your institution or can it come directly from our organization. You actually have the opportunity to choose either. So our fellows may either be institutionally administered or self-administered, and that means either we send the check directly to your institution who administers the funds to you, or that we send the check directly to you. And I will say that for dissertation fellows, it is more common to have their fellowships be self-administered, but we do not have a preference in either case.
You said, Angie, do some universities have preferences around that?
I'm not really sure. I think there are some universities that do have preferences, because there are some schools where we typically see that all of their students are, institutionally administered. So I think there are schools, but I'm not aware of what the conditions are at those schools.
Yeah, I feel like Vanderbilt's in that category, but I'm not sure why.
And here's another one that I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk about. And it's about conflict of interest and people of similar cultural backgrounds. And this person says, for example, I've heard senior faculty in conversations say that people of color scholars are sometimes told they have a conflict of interest for sharing the same cultural background as the applicant, but they don't do the same for white people. And is the application process doing anything to make sure they don't inadvertently advantage white cis hetero applicants? And I will say that diversity is extremely important to to our staff and to our members and to the people on the selection committee. And a statement such as the one that you're talking about would not be allowed during the selection process. We don't believe that there's any inherent conflict of interest between a person of color scholar reviewing a person of color applicant. And I just want to say that it's really, we are very cognizant of that, and we are constantly trying to improve our processes and really working to constantly reduce bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious.
I'm muted. How might, sorry, this is for Sean. How might someone demonstrate their interest in staying in education research in their application? Do they need to specify like their career goals, or how would you go about doing that?
Yeah, the personal statement is a great place for that. You know, I think I might have mentioned this before, that I've read narratives that made me wonder whether this was a applicant who was going to continue doing work in education. And then I read their personal statement and saw where they were coming from, and that they really are motivated by these questions, or they want to, they want their work to inform education policy, or they would love to spend their career in a interdisciplinary setting like an education school or in public policy, and maybe providing some specific examples of topics that you intend to work on in the future. That some of that might even be appropriate in the narrative itself, like talking about kind of future directions for the work and potential impact. So I think those are the best places. And letter writers, you can ask your letter writers if they have any insight at all into that, to speak to that in their letters or recommendation. That's extremely helpful.
Right, and so this is another question related to the last question that I answered, and that was, is the review committee racially and ethnically diverse? And once again, this is a priority for our organization, and so we do put a great deal of thought and care into making sure that essentially all of the committees we have are as diverse as we can possibly make them. We understand that this is important to having a fair and equitable outcome for our fellows.
Someone has asked, can international students apply? And yes, you can. You do need to be based at a U.S. institution to be eligible, but you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to apply. Though someone had asked earlier, do you need to be in residence in the United States? It's a great question, because you could be a student at a U.S. institution, but currently living outside the U.S. I don't think, that's not, doesn't go against our eligibility, although there is a question of, I guess, feasibility on my end, and just making sure you explain fully in your application why being outside of the United States will not be a problem for that. And yeah, I know this has happened before, so it wouldn't go against our eligibility rules, but you might just reach out to us. We could chat about how it might impact your application. Oh, and it looks like we're past 3. Sorry about that. We don't want to take up any more of your time. And so if you have more questions, I know we didn't get to a lot of them, please do email us and we're happy to chat with you. Thank you so much to Dr. Corcoran for providing his insight. It's always really helpful to talk to someone who's been on the other side of the table. And we hope to receive all of your applications in October. All right, thanks everyone. Take care.
Good luck, everyone.
Thank you.